Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Like some of our leading podcasters, we love a storm cloud or two in business questions, and sure enough, the poor government has been desperately hoping that recent events in America would drive the storm clouds away from the UK economy. But even though the news from Washington, D.C. has been startling to say the least, it has not been enough to dispel yet another week of adverse economic headlines. Both the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England have reportedly downgraded their growth forecasts, the latter cutting theirs by half to a measly 0.75% for the year. So much for the Chancellor's much-vaunted dash for growth. Meanwhile, the National Institute has reported that, quote, zero fiscal headroom remains to deal with any shocks in the same week that President Trump has announced 25% tariffs on steel. It's easy to see what's happened here, Mr. Speaker. Labour never expected President Trump to win. They sent a team over to campaign for his opponent. They passed an anti-growth budget, and they did not build enough leeway into their financial planning. Indeed, the Chancellor promised no new taxes or spending. Now we are having to live with the consequences. It was also hard, however, to miss the continuing controversy that the Attorney-General is creating, Mr. Speaker, and harder still not to notice the extremely critical words of his Labour colleague, the noble Lord Glassman. I do not propose to repeat those words here, but they point to two issues which demand this House's full and proper attention. In both cases, the concern is not over the legal positions taken by the Attorney-General as such, but the contradictions which they offer to the rest of government policy. People can agree or disagree about the policy, but the contradictions cannot be fudged. They cannot be blamed on others, and they require explanation. The first is in relation to international law. On the 3rd of February, the Attorney-General told the Council of Europe that the government, and I quote, would never withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights or refuse to comply with judgments of the court. In doing so, he was, of course, simply restating what has been settled UK policy for many decades, a fact which he somehow neglected to mention. The difficulty comes, however, because the government's new legislation on small boats appears to retain a measure banning migrants from claiming protections under the modern slavery laws, a ban which the Prime Minister himself went out of his way to denounce when it was first introduced in 2023. In his words at the time, "It's a crying shame that we face legislation which drives a coach and horses through our world-leading modern slavery framework which protects women from exploitation." That's quite a U-turn. But you see the deeper problem, Mr. Speaker, which is it to be? Will the government abide by international law in this instance and, quote, protect women from exploitation, in the Prime Minister's words, or will it reverse his newly adopted position in support of the ban? The second problem relates to domestic law. Last November, the Attorney-General strengthened his official guidance to government lawyers on possible legal risk. He specifically cautioned against offering legal support for policies which have only a tenable case. And elsewhere, he's pledged to restore checks on executive, that is, on government, action. But this comes at a time when the Prime Minister himself has specifically pledged to end vexatious litigation while building a huge amount of new housing and infrastructure. Again, you see the problem, Mr. Speaker. It was the problem that the noble Lord Glassman was pointing out when he praised, and I quote, the rule of law, but not of lawyers, that this edict will have a chilling effect on what I think we can all already agree is pretty sluggish decision-making by ministers. Will the government now take less legal risk, as the Attorney-General requires? Will its lawyers now require ministers to act only when it can defeat a legal challenge? Or will it curb the judicial reviews and other legal cases that will otherwise inevitably disrupt its building plans? I do not expect the Leader of the House to tell us how the government plans to resolve these obvious problems today, but the House would, I am sure, be grateful if we could have a debate in government time on what on earth the government's approach will be to resolve them.